Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kaliroi Stavrianou, and on behalf of Global Clinical Engineering Alliance, I'm really happy to moderate this series of webinars that aim to educate, promote collaboration, and also promote information exchange about healthcare technology, engineering, and patients' outcomes. All our webinars are recorded, archived, and also live streamed on Facebook. Following the completion of the webinar, the recording material will be accessible on our website, www.globalcea.org. Please note that at the bottom of the screen, you have a Q&A button where you can submit questions to the faculty, and those questions will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. In addition, for posting general comments, there is the option of the chat box for audience interaction. Please use only the Q&A for your questions to the faculty and not the chat. GCEA is very excited to remind you that we have the addition of a new live translation feature that we believe will bridge the language gap and enhance your video conference experience. All you have to do is click on the captions button at the bottom of the screen and select the language you would like to read from the drop-down menu. Today's webinar is entitled Procurement Process for Medical Equipment and Service Delivery. Now, I'm really pleased to give the floor to the webinar's moderator, Owen Hayden, who is Head of Clinical Engineering Department at the National Maternity Hospital and Chairperson of BEAI, Biomedical Clinical Engineering Association of Ireland. BEAI is a GCEA member association, and we're really proud of that. Owen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kaliroi. Hello, everyone. You're very welcome, and thank you for joining us all here today. I'm delighted to be the moderator of this webinar, which Kaliroi has said is on the topic of the procurement process of medical equipment and service delivery. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who is Andrew Gamey, who works as a clinical engineer in the UK's National Health Service and for Fishtail Consulting Limited. Andrew has been involved in the World Health Organization's procurement process resource guide and medical device specification database in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and for UNICEF. He was also part of the WHO team who developed the generic specifications for 61 medical devices. I'm very pleased to say that Andrew has just recently received his PhD, so this will be his first presentation under his doctoral status. In addition to this tremendous achievement, and although he doesn't look like it, Andrew tells me that he's a very proud grandfather and that he spends time with his family is one of his main focuses in life. So congratulations to Andrew on your PhD, and I'm just going to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Owen. Thank you, Kaliroi. It's a pleasure to be here and a real delight to see all the countries and names coming up on the attendee list. So welcome, and great to see such a variety here. As I share my screen, I hope that you'll now be able to see the slide that says medical devices, specification and evaluation. This is the topic for our meeting today. And we're going to be looking at this aspect of procurement, specifically on specification and evaluation. But we'll have a little look at the whole process as well. First of all, let me ask you a question, and you should be able on your devices to get a poll of what the responses are. So Kaliroi, if you can put up the first poll for us. You should see on your screens a question that says, have you ever used a database of ready-made device specifications? Can you select one of those? If you can on your screen, just to give us a response, to give us an idea of whether this feature that we're looking at today is going to be useful in the future. Have you ever used a database of ready-made device specifications? You've got 4 questions that you can select there, 4 answers rather, ranging from no, never heard of it, up to yes, I use it all the time. So I'll just give you a couple more seconds to look at that. If you can pop your poll answer in there. And then perhaps Caliroy now just give us the result of the poll, which says that 34% have not heard of one, 23% have not used one, but you know that they are there. 23% use it, but only rarely, and 20% use it regularly. So we've got an even spread, actually, in our audience today of people who use them a lot to don't know. And what I hope to do today is to give you an idea of how these might be used well in the future. The medical equipment life cycle is something that I think many of you will be familiar with. It ranges from having your health technology policy at the high level down to the financing and decisions that are made in planning. And then we reach the procurement and logistics stage, which we're looking at today. But then on from that, your procurement and logistics are going to be affected by all of the stages of this process. Your needs assessment, of course, is going to inform your procurement. But your procurement will have a big effect, of course, on installation, on who you need to train, on how the operation is carried out, and who maintains it. So you see that this procurement is part of the whole. It affects all the areas, and it's going to have to consider this when you write your procurement specifications. When you carry out your procurement, it's not just a single step. It's actually part of a complete jigsaw, if you like. If ever someone wants to ask what good procurement brings, you could point them to the process guide that was written back in 2011 for the WHO. And I'm not going to read all these out, but you can see that, in fact, there's a whole series of advantages here that you can see are worth doing. You want to have safe services. You want to have good delivery. Everything should work. And good procurement will help you get all these advantages. The best summary that I've ever seen is this one from Bailey, which says that we want the right product, the right quality at the right price, of the right quantity at the right place and time. It's called the 5 rights of procurement. And you can bear that in mind as you carry out your procurement process. The process itself was highlighted in this rather complex picture from the guide, which looks at the whole spectrum of activities linked with procurement. You'll see that overall you might want some technology assessment to see that things are meeting medical needs, or evaluation to see how devices on the market are meeting those needs. But when you start to actually buy the stuff, you've got to plan, do the actual buying, then install, commission, and monitor. And this is without considering even the patients being measured or seeing the benefits of these machines yet. This is all mostly before you get there, apart from monitoring. And you as clinical engineers, which I assume is what most of you are, will be nearly always focused on the 2 sections I've highlighted here, specifications and evaluation. And that's why I've chosen to focus on those, as well as the fact that that's where most of my experience is in this field for procurement anyway. You want to have a technical engineering focus on your specifications because you want to make sure they are technically competent and technically clear. You also want to have an engineer involved in your evaluation because that's a technical judgment. And you've got to have someone qualified in the technical sphere, not just someone who's ticking the boxes. So my focus is going to be here, even though we will consider the fact that it fits in the whole of this process here. But if you want to see more detail of this, go to that procurement process guide on the WHO website, and you will find the details that you want on the rest of the process. Let's look at computer software, first of all, because that's got this wonderful phrase. If you put garbage in, you get garbage out. Ask for rubbish, you get rubbish. Feed rubbish, you get rubbish. And that is entirely true for procurement. You've got to make sure, if you're going to get the right product or the service, that you've got a clear specification. That's just another quote from that process resource guide. And it makes sense, doesn't it? That you've got to say what you want. Otherwise, well, we've got plenty of examples of how it doesn't work. I'll give you a couple, but I'm sure you've got examples of your own. Ever asked for a pulse oximeter and got disposable probes? Well, it's fine if you're a very wealthy hospital with good resources and great suppliers. Not so good when you're in the Himalayas or in sub-Saharan Africa, where you've got to get customs and all sorts involved. You want reusable, so you've got to ask for it. I've had machines delivered with the user manuals in German, which was great because I had German colleagues to help, or it's great if you're on the coastal areas of Brazil, where there's a lot of German-speaking communities, but pretty difficult elsewhere. So you ask for your user manuals in the local language, or in English that you can translate, or a language that is acceptable to your client base. If you want to get something working, you need to have the right main supply. And I'm sure that many of you will have had the wrong voltage supplied to you in the past, whether it's getting 120 when you're 240 system, or the other way around, and you've got 120 main supply and you get supplied all these European goods. Well, just make sure you ask for the right thing. The letter of James says you do not have because you do not ask. So we've got to ask right. We've got to get our specifications right at the beginning. So let's clarify some of the goals. Why are we doing our specifications? Well, I've said already, you want to get what you want. We want to make sure that it actually does the job that we've been asked to provide. But not only that, we've got to make sure that it's got the right quality and it's good value. Because without those, even if you get what you want, you're not going to get a reasonable service. If it's too expensive to use, you're not going to deliver. If it's poor quality, it's not going to work. So you've got to make sure you meet all of these goals to get your specifications useful. So let's have a look at these three topics and go into a bit more detail. To get what you want, let's describe the function. And I choose that word carefully, the function, because we want to know what does it do, not how does it do it. So you ask for a device that measures blood pressure, for instance. You don't ask for a mercury column sphygmomanometer, because that tells you how it's doing it. It may not be the best that's on the market at the time. Just ask for a device that does measurement of blood pressure. That is the clinical need that you are trying to meet. The other thing, in terms of getting what you want, is to check with your users. Make sure at the beginning of the process, and in fact at the end, that you've said, what is it that you actually want? You tell me what happens in the clinic. You tell me what you want this new device to do. And don't assume that you know what they want. Someone might say, oh, I want a suction. Well, do they want a suction machine, an aspirator for surgery? Do they want a ventouse suction for delivery? What sort of suction? Is it dental? You need to be absolutely clear about their needs and where it's going to work. I've seen a specification that asks for a knife. Well, if you get a surgical knife or a Bowie knife, you're going to get two very different devices. Make sure you know which one it is. So describe the function and make sure that you know what you're asking for. When you're doing that, describe it clearly. So don't call it a sucker, call it a suction machine. Or if you're using a standard system, you call it an aspirator. And then you say where it will be used. Use those standard names, which is aspirator in fact, but suction machine is normally okay as well. Sucker is not a standard name. So you could get all sorts of devices if you just use that. The other useful habit to have is that you don't use the word should. And it may be just a slight issue with the English language, I don't know, but should gives you an option. It should do that, but it doesn't really matter if it doesn't. That's the kind of feeling behind it. When you say must, then you know that that is an obligation. It's a requirement, not an option. So use it must do this, or the device shall measure this. Don't say should. It's useful too to have a habit of asking for one item at a time. You see, if you ask for maybe a new ICU, you say, I want a pulse oximeter and an ECG recorder, you might get two different devices, you might get a multi-parameter patient monitor, or you might just get one with a little bit of something part of an ECG on the side. Just do it one at a time. Ask for your multi-parameter with all the parameters listed, or get your pulse oximeter in one specification and your ECG in another, if that's what you want. But make sure you've got one specification for one device or application. Another really helpful rule to bear in mind is that you've got to use words that you can test. Make sure that you don't just ask for a modern or a fast thing, because there's no way you know what that means. It's very hard to know what it is when you've got a modern device of some sort. What does that mean? 1990s, 2010s? We don't know. You can't measure it. So use words that you can test. And when you're doing that, describe it fully. Make sure no details are left out. I'll come on to templates in a minute, templates of patterns of ways to set out your specification. But in summary, you can just consider the function, the spares, the accessories, all these other things, the manuals and standards. Don't forget any of these. Don't, as I said before, ask just for mains power, but ask for 230 volts, 50 hertz, or whatever is your local supply. For environment, don't just say robust. For instance, oxygen concentrators, you know, are very susceptible to humidity problems. And so you've got to say, if your environment is high humidity, your oxygen concentrator has to work above 80% or 90% humidity, whatever your local environment is. But be precise, describe it fully. Then when you're writing your specification, bear in mind that you've got to evaluate at the end of the day. You've got to look ahead and see, how am I going to use this specification to check that the bids are worthwhile, that they meet the need? Will I know when I've got the right device? So imagine yourself checking the bid against the specification and say, can I tell it meets that? If you ask, for instance, your device must have a fast processor, that's no good. You can't measure that. You don't know if you've met the need. So you say greater than 1 gigahertz processor speed, for instance. Then you know whether or not you've met the specification. You can measure that. You can test it. So think evaluation, which we'll come on to at the end of our presentation now. What about quality? Sufficient quality. Interesting, I use that word, sufficient, because we mustn't over-specify or under-specify. You don't want to have a device that is the top of the range if it's going to be day-to-day use in your district hospital, because it doesn't need the really fancy machine. It needs something that is robust, good for the environment, and does a job well. So you set your limits and ranges. You say how good it's got to be and what sort of performance it's got to have. What is actually needed is the question you need to ask yourself. And then you are saved from over-specifying. For instance, I was involved in one, well, it was an argument really about a computer that there's a major computer procurement going on for rural healthcare, in fact. And they said it must have 8 USB inputs, must have 8 USB ports. And that gave rise to all sorts of problems because there was only one device that was offered that had 8 USB ports. And I was very suspicious at that point, thinking, I wonder whether they knew this. What they should have said was greater than 3 or whatever, because who needs 8? Actually, 2 or 3 would have been completely sufficient, and they would have got a better competition, a result for their bids. So imagine yourself saying, what are the limits and the ranges? By the way, in that, just for instance, don't use specific numbers, but use, instead of 3.6 millimeter tubing, say 3 to 4 millimeter tubing, get a range. And then you can measure it and get a better selection of devices, more bids that are acceptable. You can also get help to get this quality. When you're writing a specification, you can use specifications from elsewhere, but you can't copy them. You've got to edit them for local needs. The other specifications I'm thinking of are ones that have been used in your country already, or maybe you can find one online. You can also check manufacturer specifications and make sure that you're including the devices that are on the market, and make sure that you've got enough devices that fit your specification. There's another group called ECRI that can help you in this as well, although it is a subscription service, so you may not all have access to this. They run something called the Healthcare Product Comparison System, and they'll go through a lot of different devices, this one, the electrosurgical units, and talk about the different facets of the device and how it works. But most importantly, for specifications, they will give you a chart of comparative specifications, and this column with the recommended specifications gives you ranges, gives you maximums, gives you an idea of the sort of numbers you should be asking for to get a decent version. That might be helpful for you, but there are many other libraries available, because the ECRI one is quite US heavy. It tends to be for the US market, and you have to pay to get it, but it's got good comparisons in it. Another place you can look is UNICEF, who have got a catalogue online, but the problem is what the specifications there are telling you what they supply. It's this precise specification of the devices that they supply. So it's fixed, but you can use it as a benchmark, but it doesn't give you ranges. So use it with care. If you need Spanish language, then the Mexican system is a really useful one. They've got plenty of specifications on this site. And there used to be, I couldn't find it recently, but there used to be a French language set of specifications from AFIB. Indian one, which I worked on years ago, is still available from this website at the National Health Service Resource Center in India. Look up the technical resource there. But the one that you will have access to, and I want to emphasize, is the WHO. They run, they've got a set of 61 medical devices in one spreadsheet and another 13 in another set of essential healthcare devices, some simple and some much more complex. And those specifications give you this template. This is what you can use to develop your own specifications, and I will recommend that you use something like this structure. You can see I've narrowed it down to just the headlines, but it's got everything you need here to remember if you're writing a specification. So use the WHO template as your starting point, and you should find out of those 61 devices, there are some that you can use. Here's one of them, for instance, a centrifuge, which gives you the various official names, but then look how the technical characteristics are listed. You've got to have a maximum speed at least 10,000. There's a range, you see, a minimum, but above there, anything is fine. At least 60 minutes. Accuracy better than 10%. So all these phrases are useful ones to remember, and you can extract them from the medical device specifications in the WHO. If we have time, we can look at this in more detail at the end. In terms of getting the sufficient quality, though, I'll just mention also that we need to decide what matters. Leave out the unnecessary bits and pieces. The sort of thing I mean is the weight of a suction machine. Don't bother to tell people that it's got to be 2.3 kilograms if it doesn't matter. Now, of course, if it's for an ambulance, you might want to have a low weight below 2 kilograms or something. But if it's not necessary, leave it out. Let me give you a little exercise now. We're going to do another poll, and I want you to answer these questions just to see if you can get the feel for this issue. So, Kaliroy, put up this poll. You can see there's an example specification here. It says, which statements would you class as unnecessary? So you can choose multiple choices. Tell me which ones you think are unnecessary. The enclosure of the device must be black, waterproof, medical grade plastic, and be free of any sharp edges. It must be able to be opened for local servicing and repair and be visually appealing to the user or patient. Which bits of those do you think are unnecessary? What should we not have in there? Because if it's not necessary, we shouldn't write it. It will be limiting our choices. Okay, let's have a look at the results. We've got enough people responding to our poll. Can you put it up? Okay, so most people would agree with me. I agree with you that color and visually appealing are not important. The fact that it's waterproof is, I think, important, and we don't want sharp edges, so most people left those out. The waterproof, yeah, I would say that is important, probably for medical. The fact that it's plastic depends on your application, I suppose. I wouldn't say normally it matters, because we're specifying how they make it, not what the machine does. And yes, I agree with you, it must be openable for repair. So I think we've got a good feel for what is necessary, and we leave out these unnecessary bits. Let's have a quick think about what is good value. We've got to allow competition, because that brings the prices down. Don't use the brand names, and don't use precise values. Don't say, oh, the heater must be 3, 5, 6, 7 watts. Just say greater than 3,000. And the other thing is tricky here. How do you cope when a doctor wants a specific model? They say, I've got to have the GE X-ray or whatever it is. Well, you probably have rules in your procurement department that can get you out of that one. But I'd suggest if you develop your specification protocol at a very high level approval, you can point to it and say, our specification says we must not put in brand names or something like that. The other thing you can do is just find out what's there. ECRI is one source, but you can look on the internet and use trade body websites for finding out what's available if you don't know yourself. Another way to do it is to have a pre-bid meeting. Ask your local suppliers to come along and find out what's there, and then they will have a vested interest in telling you if you're being biased towards some particular supplier. And then just have a quick review before sending. Check that it makes sense. Get a user to review it. Get fresh eyes, because once you've spent so much time going over this yourself, you will be not able to see the problems, I'm sure. And again, I'd say aim for evaluation. Think about being pedantic. Can I check this? Can I check that? Have I asked this? Have I asked that? It's a really pedantic process, but if you do it item-wise, you will make your whole procurement process much easier. So here's the whole process. Our procurement is part of it, which then you can go on and get your installation and commissioning. But everything else in that circle will feed back to your procurement, because you can use the experience from one procurement process to improve your specification for the next time. So keep your specifications in a database and use them again in future. Just to summarize on specifications before we quickly look at evaluation, what do you want? Get sufficient quality, get good value. So that is a slide that you can use as your checklist. If I may, Owen, I'll just quickly go on to the evaluation then and give you a quick checklist of what you need to check the bid submissions. Once your bids have come in against a specification, develop a good recording system. Have a step-by-step process, probably a spreadsheet or something, so that you can record who said what when. Have they actually met this bit or that bit of the specification? As you do that, the evaluator should not see the prices. It's got to be totally technical, not market. Check the certificates, those standards. You can use this one I found, but there are several others. You see, we had one procurement process gave us this little section of their certificate here. It said they had an ISO certificate that was valid there. It ran out, so we asked them for an update. And this is what they gave us. Can you see what they've done? It's actually stuck on. They've faked the certificate. And when we went back to the awarding body, we discovered that it was fake. It wasn't genuine. So use notified bodies, web services to say, is this certificate true? Have they really got this certificate that you have supposedly have delivered? Ask for clarifications too. Say, have you got batteries in that spare pack or not? And then you make final recommendations. Is it acceptable or not? You can add whether there are minor or major deviations from the specification, but make sure you've got it recorded. That gives you a very brief summary of those two areas that your clinical engineering expertise will be needed for. I hope at the end we might have a chance for any questions on that, and I'll be delighted to answer them then. Thanks for your attention.
Andrew, that was excellent presentation. Very, very informative. There's a good bit of chat going on in the Q&A, which we will come back to after the next presentation. So just to remind everybody, any questions you have, put them into the Q&A section, and we will put them to Andrew at the end. I'm just going to introduce our next speaker. Our second speaker is Adrian Richards, who is a board member of the College of the BME and Engineers Australia. He's also a member of the National Committee on Clinical Engineering and also an engineer, a collaborator with the IFMBE Clinical Engineering Division. He won't be joining us in person today, but he's pre-recorded his presentation. So I'm just going to hand over to Calleroy there to hit the play button, and we will catch up in about 20 minutes for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Greetings, my name's Adrian Richards, and I'm talking to you today about procurement processes around the securing of clinical engineering services. I've worked here in Adelaide in South Australia for most of my career in either within or managing large clinical engineering departments within tertiary teaching hospitals. Just share my screen. So what I don't plan to do, I guess, is to talk to you about running a tender process or doing evaluation of tenders. There are processes which can vary from one jurisdiction to another. What I will do is give you a bit of an insight into some of the things I've learned over the years that can make a difference, and some tips and tricks, hopefully, when you might be in a position of need to secure the services of a provider of CE functions. To give you some Australian context, in the first case, healthcare in Australia is delivered like some countries in the world, but very different to others, and it's so largely a public healthcare system. So hospitals and the healthcare system generally is funded and run by the government. It's the treatment is provided to patients and recipients essentially free of charge, although what that means is funded by taxes. And the funding here is the system's called Medicare, and it is funded by every person that earns a wage in Australia being charged or being taxed 2% of that, which specifically goes to fund the healthcare system. That makes, from a clinical engineering perspective, the majority of clinical engineers here within this country are government employees. There is, of course, a private healthcare system that runs in parallel to the public system, and that is predominantly used by people who choose to take out private health insurance. Why may they choose to do that, you ask? Well, the public system, there can be significant delays or waits in that system, waiting times in that system, particularly for elective surgeries, and typically you won't have a choice of treating clinician. So there's a sector within the healthcare system that does fill that gap, and the private system, it's significant, but the bottom line here in Australia, if you're really sick, you need to be in the public system, and you'll get potentially what might be the best healthcare in the world. If the private system, for example, would not handle a major trauma case from a road accident or something, they're just not interested in that sort of thing. They treat the more elective sector of the healthcare market. So there are a couple of scenarios we can look at, and I'll look at these separately. We may be in the position of wanting to procure a full clinical engineering or health technology management service, and this most commonly happens within the private system, where there might be a small or medium-sized hospital, maybe even a chain of hospitals that is looking to secure a clinical engineering service to support their technologies, but they can't, for a range of reasons, justify employing and setting up their own CE department. That is not at all uncommon, and in fact, it predominates within the private system. The second scenario that we can envisage, and this happens all the time, is just seeking the services of a subset of a clinical engineering service to fulfill some segments of the requirement. And so basically a hospital will have a well-established in-house clinical engineering service, but there's some components of that which they are looking to, they're looking to potentially contract out or use an external service provider. That is very common in the public system, and I would say almost without exception that every large public hospital in Australia would have some parts of its service contracted out in some way, shape or form. So a full contracting out a full clinical engineering service will, as I said, will most commonly happen in the private sector and potentially in the small to medium hospitals. Sometimes financially it just doesn't make sense. For example, if you had a 50 to 100 bed hospital that needs clinical engineering input to offer its full range of services, it just doesn't make financial or operational sense for them to try and employ clinical engineers into that role. There's advantages of doing this in that in using a larger contracted provider, it can bring the strengths of that provider. So that might be an organisation that's providing service to a broader range of hospitals. And in terms of their depth of resource, the skill set they might bring to that equation, as well as the systems and processes that they might have established that can bring great benefit to a smaller organisation. Consider, for example, a small hospital having to fund a maintenance management system with all the licensing costs that are associated with that. That might not make sense for a small provider, but they might be able to get some leverage from a large contractor that has those systems already set up in place. There are also some organisations just have, in principle, a strategy to contract out support services, and this might extend to things like housekeeping, facilities management, even sterilising, those sorts of things. So sometimes there just is, particularly amongst the private sector, there might be just a philosophy of contracting out support services. And also we do see from time to time in the public system political agendas which drive contracting out of services. There are certain political parties that believe support services, for example, are better off in the hands of the private sector via a contractual arrangement, or better off or worse, that will prevail, and often there might be little impact any of us can have on that. So in terms of if we're contracting out some elements of an existing service, as I outlined before, this will be our clinical engineering department that has is well established already within a hospital, there are good reasons to contract out some elements of that service on occasions. One of them, and this is quite common, we see it a fair bit, is the support of complex technologies. And medical imaging equipment is probably the classic example here. And I think I could safely say that, for example, every MRI scanner in Australia is most likely supported by a vendor contract. And there are a few technologies like that where establishing and maintaining the skill set, as well as negotiating all the factory support and spares access and that sort of thing for complex technology just doesn't make sense on a number of levels. There's times when we can reduce cost of providing a service if we have a limited install base. If you consider some higher tech equipment where we might have just a couple of units that require support within a facility, obtaining the training, purchasing the training, maintaining a stock of spare parts, many of which probably not going to be used throughout the life of the equipment. Sometimes that the standing costs for providing the service just don't add up and we're considering things here like maybe heart lung bypass, ECMO, those sorts of things where a medium-sized hospital might just have 2 or 3 of them, setting up all of the infrastructure and maintaining the skill set to support technologies like that might not just make financial sense. Managing staffing resource, there's peaks and troughs in demand at times for many departments. Contracting out or getting contractors in to do work is a very common strategy. Lack of training or software accessibility, we could talk about that for a whole webinar just in itself if we want to start talking about right to repair, but we don't see it much here in Australia. But there certainly are examples where the availability of training or software keys or documentation to support equipment is difficult, or it might come with a number of caveats which impact upon the viability, like they might mandate training or mandate various licenses or retraining. And so there are times when it makes logical sense, maybe for not the best reasons, but it makes logical sense to contract out that work. Mitigating financial risk is something which happens fairly commonly, and particularly maybe in those more complex technologies like medical imaging. People financing clinical engineering departments don't necessarily want too many peaks and troughs in the budget. I guess they happen anyway, but if they can use a strategy which will tend to smooth out the bumps, then they think that's actually a pretty good idea on occasions. And so the taking out of a contract will let them know exactly what a technology is going to cost to own. Typically, that may cost them more. In fact, almost certainly that'll cost them more, but they're happy with the certainty rather than the saving. You can argue the case pretty strongly that contracts don't necessarily provide the best value for money, but they do give consistency, and that does have its advantages. Reliable access to upgrades, that not necessarily, this is sort of tied in with sort of contracts on things like imaging equipment, not necessarily actually getting the upgrades themselves, but having access to the funding to actually purchase them. And a comprehensive contract, for example, will typically include upgrades, whereas if you're handling that via some other way, such as fee for service or in-house support, then those contracts and funding will have to be found to purchase those. And it's not at all uncommon to see software revisions or even hardware revisions of equipment to fall well behind, purely because there's no mechanism to actually purchase them when they become available. And we always want to make sure that our clinical engineers and technicians their skills are being used to best advantage. And there are times when there's often high volumes of work which require lower mix of skills that might not be the best use for your established clinical engineers within an in-house department. And there's things like examples like maybe working on gas accessories like flow meters and regulators, that sort of thing, where you might be able to put your own staff to better use and maybe use an alternate supplier for some work such as that. So the key issues, if we're looking to contract out or procure a whole service, and these are really some, I guess, some take-home points. Most importantly, some of these are fairly obvious, but a reasonable amount of time and effort needs to put in to really focus on some of these things and really get the detail right. Clearly specifying the scope of service and procuring via a formal process, I think, is essential. Formal process, this could well be in the public system here, like a public tender call, which would go out to all potential providers. There are times also when that might be a contract with a vendor, but certainly going through the terms and conditions in great detail so that everyone's clear on what might be delivered. A key part of that also is being very sure on which technologies are in and excluded. That's often where the debate will arise. And, are medical gas systems in or out, or are the hospital beds in or out? Those sort of things, that discussion should very much be had up front and be clearly documented in a contractual arrangement that might be established, and certainly have, a process or a mechanism to make changes or variation to this, because the environment will change, the technologies will change, and you don't want to be left with your customers within the hospital sort of sitting around looking at each other thinking, oh, who looks after that? Is the clinical engineering department or the vendor, or what's actually going on here? So being very clear on that scope of service and the technologies that are covered will save a fair bit of grief as time goes by. Also be very clear on what the organization's expectations are beyond what could be considered just straight out health technology management. Is it all about just managing the equipment, making sure it's fit for purpose and available when it's needed? Or are they offering, or is the organisation seeking a broader clinical engineering role? In other words, what roles on committees? Are they supporting R&D? Are they involved in incident investigations, and just all of those other things that go above and beyond just buying, supporting and managing the equipment? And that can be, the private organisations that are offering these services can vary significantly in just the full range or scope of service they might offer. Be very clear on the service levels, and even fairly obvious, I guess, the performance, response times, the hours of service at 24/7, all those sorts of things. They're really vital to ensuring customers actually receive what they want and need. Have them define the number and the level of staff, the level of qualification, the level of experience. It ties in with them meeting their service levels or their key performance indicators, but make sure that they're very clear on how many staff they might place within the department, how many staff they have available, can they meet the demand, how they handle peaks and troughs, and be aware of companies that might bid for work, but then not necessarily have the capacity to deal with it should they be successful in negotiating a contract. We see that far too often within broader government processes where significant activities will be contracted out and then it trips over on day one when the contract is supposed to start. How will the contract and the service be reviewed? How will client satisfaction be assessed? Are there regular meetings? Are there reports that are expected? What will those reports include? What are the measures that will be used to determine success? Those sorts of things. How long the contract is established for? That will have quite some impact on the commitment that an organisation might demonstrate to the service. And if you're offering a 5-year contract, that'll probably, you might get a fair different outcome than if you're offering a 6-month. So consider that real partnership sort of scenario where a lengthy contract will see a provider invest more heavily in the service they provide and the people that they locate on the sites. And also have a process around dispute resolution. There will be disputes, there's no question of that, there always will be. Just be clear on how that's resolved, and ideally that doesn't become adversarial. And my philosophy has always been, if people are reaching for the contract to read the fine print, then probably the argument's already been lost and the relationship's already been tarnished. There needs to be ways of issues being resolved before people resort to that. We're looking at elements of an existing service. This is an established CE department that just needs to get some additional assistance or manage some technologies in a different way. Here, the focus more, I guess, is on operational and performance elements of an agreement, and you're not interested in whether a provider might be able to provide a full CE service as opposed to a repair and maintenance service. All those functions are already established within the CE department. So here we'll be more thinking about response times, uptime guarantees, capacity to handle work and those sorts of things. So it's more of an operational focus, I guess. The person undertaking the work can be critical. You need to be very clear on what their qualifications and experience are and ask for evidence of that. And probably the worst example I've seen not that long ago was a person that was sent to us under a contractual arrangement who 2 weeks before he started work in the hospital, his job was a landscape gardener. We were assured that he was provided with comprehensive training and was well and truly up to speed in doing the work, but he wasn't, and he exposed patients to great risk. Reporting arrangements, what sort of service reports, what sort of documentation do you want? How is that going to be presented? Time scales around that, you need it in a timely manner, you need it in a good format. Can they use your in-house maintenance management system? Can you give them logins? All that sort of thing can really make for a streamlined service. Again, dispute resolution. Have a think about just the commercial arrangements. Do you want a contract? Do you want a short-term contract, long-term contract? Do you want a fee for service arrangement? Or it's certainly worth on occasion thinking about more of a partnership agreement. And certainly I've used in the past agreements where the in-house people would provide first line service. Maybe there'd be a stock of spare parts located within the facility, but ultimately the vendor might be there as a backup or to provide more comprehensive support should it be required. This can be particularly useful if you're looking for very short response times, or as we see here in Australia occasionally, a vendor may not have support staff located within your city. They could be 3 or 4 hours flight away. So that's very important in terms of maintaining uptime. Reference clients. This can be the best indicator of how well someone is going to fit into your organization and the level of service they're going to provide. You need to dig pretty deep in this regard, I believe. And if you ask via some formal process or even during initial negotiations with a potential supplier, who else are you providing this service to? Can I chat to them? They'll undoubtedly give you very user-friendly referees, and they'll give you people that will talk about them in glowing terms. You need to dig as deep as you can behind that. And you want to hear about the bad ones as well as the good ones. They won't offer you that up freely, most likely, but you need to ask them questions like, give us a list of all the organizations you provided service to in the last 12 months or the last 6 contracts you've signed. If they get to cherry pick the referees they give you, you won't learn much from this part of the process. You'll just get glowing reports. And I've seen that backfire on more than one occasion when the reality emerges as to what they can actually provide. And you realize that apart from the 3 friendly referees they provide you, there's half a dozen very bad ones just lurking in the background. You have to find them, you have to talk to them. Just a note here, some people debate this a little bit, but if you're looking for a true clinical engineering service provider, the vendors don't provide that as a general rule. If you're taking out a vendor support contract to support your CT scanner or something like that, don't kid yourself that they're providing a clinical engineering service. They're providing a repair and maintenance service. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, just be aware that they're very focused, they're extremely good at what they do, but that needs to fit within the context of the limitations that come with that. So they'll fix your CT scanner, but they might not be aware of just a whole range of other peripheral things going on around that, which could be quite important to the outcome. So just a few take-home messages, which hopefully people might find useful. Just this is restating a couple of points I've already made. Just be very clear on your expectations. Don't sort of make it up as you go along. Just upfront with the hospital management or the healthcare system manager or whoever you're dealing with who's driving this. Be very clear with them what they're looking for, and you can provide advice into that decision, obviously. And then really gain that evidence that any provider that you might secure the service of can actually fulfill those expectations competently and completely. If they can't, then look further, redefine your expectations, have another plan, have multiple providers, do whatever you need to do, but don't find that what you present as a sort of a carefully and clearly worked up service has gaps in it that that really start to cause you grief pretty quickly. Ensure a provider has the capacity to fulfill their obligations, that they don't oversell and underdeliver. We see that far too often, and they prospectively put in an offer and then think, wow, when they're awarded it, wow, where are we going to get the staff from? Again, at a higher government level, we see that far too often. I can't emphasize this enough. Assess past performance of other sites. Use your network, speak to whoever you need to speak to, ring around. You just need to talk to somebody that a potential provider has done work for and really get the full story. And also just get a feel for the service provider. Are they someone you're going to have to potentially work with them, work through tricky scenarios, deal with issues that arise, deal with upset customers. There's a whole range of things you're going to have to deal with. So make sure anyone that whose services you secure, that you really feel like there's someone that you can get along with. And that's really just a bit of intuition. You know, you can't specify it. You can't sort of develop a KPI around it. Just the people within the organization, the people they'll be sending on site, the people that will be interacting with your clients on your behalf. Just as best you can, just judge on how you believe that organization might function when they really become an integral part of the service you're providing, not only to your healthcare system, but the patients that it serves. So thanks for your time. I hope you might have picked up some a few words of wisdom in amongst that. Happy to take questions via that email address there. Happy to be challenged. Happy to engage in any way that you see fit. And thank you very much for your time.
That's great. Thanks, Calaroy. It's just to remind everybody that a recording of this webinar will be made available on the Global Clinical Engineering website tomorrow. The email address will be shared. And Adrian's contact details, as you saw, were at the end of his presentation there, if anybody has any specific questions for him. But before we move on to the Q&A section, just ask Calaroy, would you mind pulling up that poll for us, if that's okay? And this is just, I'm going to read this out just for the benefit of the recording, but if people can just answer this, how much of what was taught in this webinar is already applied by you in your clinical engineering activities for equipment incorporation? So it's a one choice answer. So less than 20%, between 20 to 50, or more than 50%. And the second part of this poll is how much of what was taught in this webinar will help you to improve your procurement activities. And again, single choice. I do not participate in the procurement activities in my work. Less than 20%, between 20 to 50%, or more than 50%? And we'll just give participants a minute to answer that, and we'll pull up the results, Caleroy, whenever you're ready. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the answers to the first part of the question. So how much of what was taught in this webinar is already applied by you in your clinical engineering activities for equipment incorporation? And interesting that it's almost an even split, really. 46% of people say that they use more than 50% of what was taught, and 44% of people say they use between 20 to 50% of what was taught. So that's good. So some of these procurement processes are already being used by people in their everyday life. Less than 20% of 10% of participants use these less than 20% during the day. The second part of the question is how much of what was taught in this webinar will help you to improve your procurement activities. And it's good to hear that over 50% of participants say that they will use what was taught over 50% of the time. 30% will use it between 20 to 50%. 11% of participants do not participate in any procurement activities. That's interesting. Right, we can close it off, Caleroy. I think we'll move on to the Q&A section. Just conscious of time, we've just gone beyond the hour mark. We received quite a lot of questions through the Q&A function. Andrew is actually typing answers to them quicker than I can read them. So we might just go over a few of them here. There's one or two that stood out to me, Andrew, and then because you've read through them, there might be something different that you'd like to talk about. But I was interested in the question from Tashi, I think his name is, and there was a follow-up point by Emmanuel, where he has said allowing competitions in supply of medical equipment, especially in developing countries, leads to proliferation of numerous brands and ultimately becomes a big challenge in timely maintenance. Therefore, I feel standardization of brands of medical equipment rather than allowing open competition should be encouraged in low resource countries. What are your thoughts? So I know you've replied to him, but others might be interested in the answer. If you want to just quickly.
Yeah, well, if you look at the Q&A, I think everyone can see what I've replied there. And Emmanuel's point is true as well, that it does make standardization difficult. Particularly, I think we've seen across the world that donations are a real problem here too, not just procurement, where you get given different devices and it creates enormous problems for spares supply, for training users. Even in industrialized countries, you find that standardization is something that hospitals will try to do to make life simpler, to help users to be able to switch devices more easily when they break and they're being serviced. And it's obviously a useful goal. It does reduce the variety of function maybe that you get, and you've got to balance it here with the costs of providing new training for users on a separate piece of equipment with the cost savings of having a single set of spares supply. And I think there's never really an easy answer here, really, is there, Owen? I mean, it's something that affects a hospital anywhere in the world. Do we standardize? Do we give people free hands? And I think there's an argument for a balance that some things do get better standardized. Yeah,
it's interesting, yeah. Right, okay, I'm just going to read out Toby's question that he put up, is that the World Health Organization MEDEV's Priority Medical Device Information System was not listed. Anyway, it is open access to electronic database of medical devices. It includes device specifications and has been valuable to our organization. So I suppose it's important, I suppose, to highlight that to people as well as a resource that it is also available as well. And I see Toby had put the link up to it there, and I know you have responded to Toby on that one. So that's also an important point to note. There was a question I wanted to ask you, Andrew, was that during the evaluation process, you obviously have to apply weighting criteria to how you evaluate the manufacturers. And oftentimes it's a battle with your colleagues in the tendering department. It's almost the quality versus the price, the cost of it. And, you know, from a technical point of view, you want not the highest quality, but the best quality or the best value for money. but oftentimes manufacturers or distributors, I find, are you know, they know that it's going to be weighed heavily on price, and therefore they're putting in products that would be of low quality, and it's hard then to get the right balance and get the right product into your organization, knowing that somebody has undercut the competition just to get their product into the healthcare institution, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. There's this balance. It reflects on Smriti's question actually about the assuring the quality of the medical device, where you've got this balance between the cost and the quality, which is where setting the rules at the beginning of your procurement process, getting your documents right in a really careful planning way is absolutely essential. So you know right from the beginning, all the bidders will know 60% technical, 40% cost, or whatever the balance is. It's absolutely clear. Then you've got this specification business of making sure it's sufficient quality. So you've got a boundary. We need to have more than 2 USB sockets, but less than 6, or you know, that's a silly example, but it gives you a range, will give you an idea of where your window is that you want to hit. So no one's going to be able to go under it and still qualify, and no one's going to go over it and still qualify. So this is where your ranges are absolutely essential to get that window of the market that you want. Yeah,
it's complex, and then it's only by doing it you build up the experience of doing it. You know, like the must and the shall versus the should point that you made earlier on is very interesting and relevant too.
Yeah, and getting that quality certified or assured is always a headache. Where you know, I've seen fake certificates. I've seen groups that operate out of someone's bedroom supplying certificates for medical devices, and you've got to just get to know really what are the reliable test houses, what are the national levels. You can look actually on the EU Europa website and find what test houses are actually approved. FDA, of course, run their own systems as well. And once you're there, you know you're dealing with someone you can trust. But I always have a look. If I see a test house giving a quality certificate that I haven't heard of, I'll always look at their website and their address. And I may even go on Google Street Maps and have a look at where their office is, because I found it's someone's own house. And you immediately start to uncover a process of fake certificates.
That's good advice. Were there any questions in there, Andrew, that you answered that you think might be of particular interest to participants? Anything in particular you want to go over, or will I continue to read a few out?
Well, there's another one from Anthony here on the training for offering service training for the in-house team, and that's something that you will find suppliers are very reluctant to do. There are balances of cost, of course. You can try and cost out what it would cost to services in-house with bought supplies, where you're still at the mercy of the supplier, but at least you can do the labor costs yourself and try and influence your supplier to say, we're going to do this if you don't cut your cost. And they will only get money on the spares, not on the service. That might actually give you a better competitive bid from them for the actual services. But, you know, it's often a debate, a bit of a bargaining there with the suppliers as to get them to offer proper services. I'm not aware, are you, Owen? I'm not aware of standards that apply where manufacturers must offer training to in-house maintenance staff. No, there isn't.
No, I'm not aware of it either. No, I'm willing to be corrected though.
It may change. You know, the right to repair movement and so on may hit medical devices. That may change, but at the moment, I don't think you can do that.
Yeah. There's another question there about interfacing with IT systems. Is also reducing the open procurement, so reducing the options, I suppose, as well as who is trying to mention there. She's saying, or saying that IT systems are expensive to invest in, but I suppose if you need to interface with an IT system, you're then narrowing the open competition aspect of the evaluation.
Yeah, you are, and that's the sort of situation where you might have to do a particular systems bid, where you get the big manufacturers to cost the supply of the IT and the X-ray and the patient record system, so that they all fit together and do it as a package rather than one by one, and then you've got to fit it together. Actually get the suppliers to do it if you can, But that's, of course, only if you've got a new system being ordered all at the same time.
And write it in such a way as that it doesn't appear brand specific. I think you've already.
Well,
Yeah. It's a tough balance in that. There's lots of questions in there as well, but I'm just conscious of people's time, Andrew. It's 4:10. I think we've covered a lot. As I said, the recording is going to be made available to people. Contact details are provided there as well. And I'm sure if anybody has anything specific, they can get in touch with Caleroy on through the. There you go. There. There's the link to the website globalcea.org, and there'll be contact details on there as well for participants if they have anything more specific that they want to go through. So I just want to thank everybody for attending here this afternoon, and also thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. Really interesting. I feel like I could sit here and chat to you about it for another hour. And also a big thanks to Adrian, who pre-recorded before going on, I think, a holiday. So thanks to everybody, and we hope to catch up with you all again soon.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye to all, and thank you very much for the presentation. Fantastic. Really, I really like this webinar. Thank you very much, Ewan, and Andrew, and Richards. Bye, Caleroy. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.